Good morning, everyone. This is the science track. And you all are here for Speculative Evolution. Ooh. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping things. Please keep your masks on at all times. Please don't eat. Please don't have your cell phones on silence. I have them on silence. There we go. It's Sunday. Give me a second on that. Also, I want to speak real quick on the Dragon Con charity. It's open hands. They're giving complete nutritional rich foods to those in need. So if you have any pennies, quarters, ruples, anything really, we'll take them and donate them. Dragon Con will match up to, I think, $10,000 or something, dollar for dollar, or $100,000. I don't remember what it is, so help us make them pay. Anyway, and then also the big panel coming up at 1 o'clock is science tracking the multiverse of multiverses, and then later on today, educators versus scientists who explain it better. That will be at 4 o'clock. But anyway, you're not there for that. You're here for Speculative Evolution. I'll bring it on to you.
So, just letting you all know, for accessibility purposes, we may pull down our mask to speak, like I am now, to make it easier for people to hear and read lips. But otherwise, we're please asking you to keep yours on. Thank you.
So my three friends who entered in the back, can you please put on your masks? Thank you. Hello. Welcome to Speculative Evolution. I'm Mouse Hecht. I am the moderator for this panel. I am primarily a first grade elementary school teacher by trade. Thank you. Thank you. And so we are going to do a quick background information, but before we get into that, I would love my panelists to introduce themselves.
So let's start down there.
You want to start down here? Sure. Hello, I'm David Moscato. I am a paleontologist and science communicator. I am the science communication specialist at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum, which is about 5 hours north of here. Fossil Site Natural History Museum, very cool place. And I am one half of the hosts of the Common Descent podcast, which will be mentioned again in 2 people.
Hi, is this? Okay, it is. Hi, I'm Emily Fink, or Celix on the internet. I am a forensic anthropologist and science communicator, and I'm sorry, I have not had caffeine yet. Good morning.
Hello, everyone. My name is Will Harris. I am the other half of the Common Descent podcast, also a science communicator, also a paleontologist. And now I'm working full-time on our podcast, so I'm also an editor, I guess, technically.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Danielle Lee, or DN Lee 5 on social media. I'm a biology professor. I'm a mammologist, so I teach mammalogy and natural history and intro to biology and evolution to undergraduate students.
So, my first question for my panelists, just again to get some background information. How does evolution work? Is Pokemon real?
We have a word for that, and it's metamorphosis.
Yes.
The change from one form to another during the life of an individual is more like metamorphosis. Evolution happens between the generations.
Yeah. So the big thing to know that what evolution is so the textbook thing is like change over time. But here's the thing, we mean big time, like billions time, like time that you cannot imagine. Like your own mortality means nothing.
What we call deep time.
Deep. It's like you don't matter. And here's the thing, and evolution doesn't even work at the individual level. It's population. So like you don't matter. Not even this room matters. I mean, the totality of like maybe all of Atlanta, if we were a population, it might matter. So we're talking about big time, big time, big amounts of stuff happening. And so it's those changes that happen, if they take hold over big periods of time.
And this could be random change. It could also be those changes that give you benefits and make you more successful at surviving and drive new traits to evolve. But it could also just be your DNA accruing mistakes and being different than it was a million years ago.
Sure. Which a million isn't a lot of time.
No.
It's nothing.
Oh.
It's nothing.
So when we talk about natural selection, what we're talking about, selection sounds like someone is pointing a finger and like, yes, that one, that one, that one. But it's a passive selective process. So if you have a big population, there is inevitably going to be, every individual is going to be a little bit different. And every individual is going to have to deal with the same environmental pressures of getting food and getting shelter and getting water and
Getting
finding
caffeine.
mates.
Thank you.
Thank you for the selective pressure.
So the ones whose variation lets them do that a little bit better are more likely to have babies, more likely to pass on those traits, and so certain features will continue into the next generations and certain others will fall behind.
Yeah. Now the random part that a lot of folks don't think about. So let's say that's all happening. It's like, okay, that makes sense. The thing that does well leaves more copies of itself. Random stuff can happen, like, you know, a big fireball comes out of the sky, or there's an earthquake, or someone's just not feeling well that day, you know, their hip hurts, and then boom, a predator takes them out. Like, otherwise they're perfect, should be ideal, and they're no longer there. And that, once they're gone, that package of genetic material is gone, those opportunities. And so, like I like to tell the students, you know, we hear love don't love you. Natural selection doesn't love you either. It does not care about you. And the one that wins, if there were a winner, it's the one that leaves the most babies. Yep. It's like, did you live? Did you make babies? From natural selection's point of view, nothing else matters. Asterisk until it does. Yeah.
So, to go further onto that, what are some like common selective pressures that species might face to cause sort of these changes to happen maybe a little bit more faster?
One of the biggest ones is lack of resources, lack of food, lack of mates, lack of space. That there is not enough stuff to go around for all the life that could live on the planet, like that we could fit on the planet. So there's going to be competition. We're going to have to fight for food. You know, animals are going to have to fight for food. They're going to have to fight for enough mates to be able to reproduce or just space to live. And that is naturally going to push some of them out of the survivable situation. They're going to be pushed out of their environment. They're going to starve, or they just don't get to reproduce. Yeah. And so just lack of resources is one of the biggest selective pressures, because it's going to inevitably result in some of the animals dying or not passing on their genes.
In the arms of...
Yeah, and then anything else that basically, if it can kill you, it will have an effect on natural selection and evolution. So diseases can certainly put on a selective pressure. Environmental hazards. So if you live in particularly harsh conditions or even particularly nice conditions, whatever the conditions around that habitat. And we keep saying you, which makes it very familiar for us animals, but this also applies to plants, and it applies to fungi, and it applies to bacteria. Yeah. Anything that could potentially knock something out of the gene pool is something that can potentially impact the evolutionary course of that lineage.
And on the other hand, getting a random mutation, so that, say you are a creature that lives in a mountainous area and you suddenly have a random mutation that makes your fingers just a little bit more graspy, and you can suddenly move up just even 6 more inches and take advantage of the space where the rest of your population can't. That would be a more positive mutation that can lead towards a population change.
Yeah, increases your competition chances.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, that the large numbers, that even if 6 inches isn't much, every single chance you get.
Yep.
Yeah, but here's the flip side. Let's say that happens, but if you're the only one up there, or you can't get a population to take hold or stick, it could have been otherwise perfect. And then, but you never had the numbers you needed to really get it going. Yep. Then, poop. Doesn't matter.
You could be that one with access to 6 more inches of space, but you could also have a slightly, slightly smaller beak and not be able to catch whatever little buggy is up there,
Yeah.
and suddenly you have that more space, but you can't compete food wise.
Yeah, it's like the one-hit wonders of, in evolution. It's like, that was a nice hit, but where are they now?
Well,
And I like that earlier, Danielle, you mentioned the idea of some things just being bad luck. And you mentioned the big fireball coming out of the sky, which is a great way to get paleontologists to perk up. Yeah, about 66 million years ago, a big asteroid hit the Earth, and it kicked up a big cloud of dust, and it created an ecological catastrophe all over the world that basically nothing was adapted for.
yeah.
That nothing had the adaptation that made them perfectly adapted to survive the apocalypse.
No evolutionary preppers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because evolution doesn't prep. Evolution, there's no planning ahead. It's a passive process. So yeah, sometimes there's a volcanic eruption, or there's a flood, or your little piece of land that is connected to the rest of the population gets cut off by the rising water levels, and now your population is too small. Sometimes a random thing happens and it just knocks you out of the running.
So the fancy word we like for that is like stochastic events. So that's it. So some stochastic events, it's like you could do everything right. Like, I did everything right, and yet and still here we are.
Yeah, the universe doesn't adapt to your adaptations. It's just going to happen.
Yeah. It's like rain
Well,
on a rainy day.
thank you all for that lovely sort of background information on how evolution happens. So we're going to start turning it over to y'all. And so, big important thing, you need to eat the mic. So if you notice how close I am to
Gotta be
the
Michael
mic.
McDonald.
Yeah. So, please make sure you have a question. A long story that ends in an inflection is not a question. So, yes, please have a question about speculative evolution of your favorite fandom creature, being, whatever, and we will try to figure out how it evolved.
All right, how I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it section by section. So 1, 1, 1, 1, and go back and forth like that. So
Hi, you said deep time for seeing the process of evolution. In a situation where we have like fruit flies that live and die in 3 days or something, and we can see 100 generations a year, how many generations are we talking about to observe evolutionary changes?
That's a great question, and it would depend by the organism. Fruit flies, bacteria, where you can get millions of generations within our lifetime. You can see evolution happening basically in real time. We have bacterial colonies where we have watched them evolve new traits, new adaptations that they did not have previously. But then if you go to like an elephant, which is at twice the rate we are for how long it takes to have young, it's going to be much slower. It's going to be much harder. That's why we haven't domesticated animals like that, because it would take multiple people's lifetimes to even have a couple of generations of elephants really come through. So with those, you would have a much slower process, and we actually see that affect their survivability.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. This idea that I say deep time, but time is also relative to the organism. So, time is different. Like, what time is matters for the size of the organism. So not that much different than what we saw happening with Ant-Man when he was in that state. Like, time moves differently. And that's because you need so many generations. We tend to look at things, if we're looking for, even at what we call microevolution, so just looking for small little changes in parts of the genome, we're still looking at order of magnitude, like thousands of generations just to see that. And so people who really want to study that tend to study very teensy things. So the smaller the thing, the more you can kind of see those things. So we would call that scale. And so I'm an organismal biologist. I care about the whole thing. Then you can go up from that, which is population, so lots of the same thing. You can go community, lots of different things and lots of them. And then you can go below the individual, like what's going on in our bodies. Like we can just look at certain organs, like, oh, I just want to know how your liver works or how you digest stuff. That's important for your evolution. Like if all of a sudden you're not able to process proteins, and that's how you get, you need proteins to survive. Well, that's going to tank your ability to survive and have babies in the future because you can't get the right nutrients. And then you can go below that, the molecules. And so evolutionaries, they're like, you know what? I don't care about that whole organism. That's just a package. That's just a meat package or a plant package. We don't care about that thing. I want to look at I want to look at the DNA. I want to see how the Gattaca lines up. And I only care about Gattaca. And that's important. But biologists like me is going like, but that DNA isn't all that. That's my thing. I'm like, that DNA is in a package. And it's that package that moves and behaves and carries it from one place to the next. And how it behaves determines whether that DNA finds another half of DNA and to live on. So it's complex.
Yeah, and as an example, as an anthropologist, you can be looking at two different sets of things. You can be looking at speciation in the hominid line, at which point you're looking at millions of years. Or you could be looking at micro changes in populations. You could be looking at the spread of lactose tolerance or lactose intolerance, which could even happen in a couple of centuries. It's very different scales depending on when you're looking at. So say a anthropologist in the Star Trek world could be looking at the population level shifts, cultural shifts that speciated Romulans from Vulcans, but they could also be looking at the millions of years before that introduced the plasticity into the Romulan-Vulcan line that allowed them to make fundamental shifts in basically their biology using their culture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's important as we're thinking about, speculative evolution, and like you said, Star Trek, if we're thinking about fictional things and imagining how we might evolve those things, it's going to be a very different story if it's something like Godzilla versus something like, oh my goodness, name a very tiny fictional thing. I was got like Yoda's a terrible example.
Ewoks.
There we go, Ewoks. That's going to have an effect.
Well, midichlorians are an excellent example of a microevolution. You would be tracking midichlorians throughout sets of population groups rather than through millions of years of deep time.
Yeah. So scale matters. So scale matters in evolution. I don't know where the mic is.
So my question isn't necessarily fantastical based, but how do you think that evolution is going to take in consideration like microplastics? Plastics have a tendency to deregulate hormones, and it affects biology significantly when you get down to it. How do you think our ecosystems are going to change?
How you think our what is going to change? Thank you.
Are things going to respond to microplastics? For everyone who doesn't know, microplastics are what happens when our plastic products erode, when they wear down and break down into just tiny, almost microscopic chunks of plastic, which are small enough to actually almost make it inside cells and can just contaminate. They do it to sea life, and then things eat that, and then we eat that, and then you have plastic in your body.
I'm a Barbie girl.
I was just going to have a quick question, and correct me if I'm wrong, but don't some microplastics pass the placental barrier?
Ooh, I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. The problem with asking about humans is that our major tool is cultural change.
Mm-hmm.
So to answer that question, we have to know how we're going to react. So one group could take control and we could deregulate plastics entirely and end up with one kind of microevolution. And this is value neutral. Evolution doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
Or we could end up with stronger regulations. We could end up with a different kind of microevolution and a different set of parameters. We don't know yet. We as cultural beings have to shape the world and shape that evolutionary process as humans.
Yeah.
I could see for the life that can't say litter less, the fish that are going to be eating the microplastics and can't avoid it, An immune system response would be something that immune system might figure out a way to start detecting plastic, because that's plastic and glass doesn't register in biological systems the same way organic material does. So that's why it can get lodged in your body and just stay there, because your body doesn't see it as a thing that it can recognize. So if they can figure out how to chemically recognize plastic, they could start capsuling it and putting it into probably really gross cysts of plastic, or like a gallbladder of plastic or something, and compartmentalizing it out of the system so that you still wouldn't want to eat that fish in one bite, but you might be able to remove the pebbles of plastic in its body. That's real gross.
Just chew,
It's
bite,
gonna become
bite
the new pearls.
Ugh.
Alternatively, it could be that the animals will evolve to be just completely ignore the plastics. Like if they end up with a different hormonal signaling system that is not interrupted by those plastics, that too would be a type of microevolution.
Yeah,
within
or improved
populations.
sensory capacity.
Yeah.
Improved sensory capacity so that then they can avoid the plastics altogether, or whatever they eat if the plastic contamination is too high. So you go like, nope.
Yeah.
I think I have another question over there.
You mentioned the packaging for DNA, and I wonder if you could speak on epigenetics and how the expression of the genotype and phenotype might slow or speed evolution. For the sci-fi connection, maybe like Orson Scott Card's Speaker for the Dead, those species.
I guess first thing, make sure everyone's okay in epigenetics. Who wants?
So epigenetics basically controls the way, let me figure out translating it into language that we use academically and that makes sense is challenging. So epigenetics controls the way our genetics react to the environment.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. So it's almost magical. I'm gonna say it. I remember when it first started hitting the scene. I was like, wait, what? You mean after telling me for years that the genes are all that matter, the DNA, you're saying it's this magic molecular cloud around the double helix, and it does all the woo.
Yeah. So
it does woo, and it says unravel or not. No, that part we're going to keep knotted up. And if you're knotted up, you can never, ever, do the DNA stuff. At this point, you don't need the fancy words. Do the DNA stuff. And if you can't do the DNA stuff, your body doesn't do the things. So that's why I was saying, like, the molecules matter. Like, the molecules in the body. And so the body, organism, I'm just doing things. So I'm just doing things. For some reason, I eat a lot of protein because I'm a carnivore. I must eat lots of protein. Well, there's something genetically that unravels that says, feed me protein now, because I need it to do magic machinery in the body. And the epigenetics is that woo, those molecules hovering, that determine. That's magic as far as I'm concerned as an organismal person. Anything molecular is magic in my opinion.
You've heard it on Science Track.
It's magic.
Yep.
But no, it is a really, really cool, fascinating area. And it controls everything from, does this cell differentiate into my brain, into my spinal column, into my anus, into my toe? Like, it says, grow a brain cell here. Grow my heart here. Grow my toe here. And if you move some of those cellular signals to another place, you can say, grow a toe on your arm. Grow a tooth in your cheek, on your cheek. Let's not do that, because cheeks sounds terrifying. But yeah, that controls all of that.
It's magic. It's magic, I say, as an organismal biologist who doesn't want to touch a microscope.
I mean, I have seen a really cool picture of a fruit fly with eyes growing out of its face, and it's just like, that's so cool, scary, so cool.
So, and the key thing that makes epigenetics so interesting is you can pass it on to generations. So you can pass it on to the next generation, but it's not a mutation. It hasn't changed the code of your DNA. Your DNA has begun to behave differently. And so it means that DNA can adapt quicker than what we typically expect on an evolutionary scale, but be passed on generation to generation. So it allows for some really odd, quick adaptations that we still are trying to understand. Like, this is very new.
So this is one of the things that a lot of folks get confused. It's a commonly misconstrued thing. So if you get it confused, it's okay. There's a difference between something being heritable and inherited. And I like to explain this through juveniles. She get it from my mama. So, he's like, where did she get her eyes from? She get it from my mama. That's because it's genetic. Well, where did she get her thighs from? Well, she get it from my mama. But, yeah, that's genetic. But if they have the same diet that has nothing to do with genes, yes, it's heritable, but it has nothing to do with the genetics proper. You get a lot of stuff from your parents that have nothing to do with genes proper, but it influences all of that stuff, and that's the amazing part that makes it hard to study evolution, actually.
Do you have another question? Oh.
Yes, in keeping with the theme of speculative evolution, anyone familiar with evolutionary theory has, I'm sure, seen many movies and TV shows where the monsters or aliens or whatever don't follow evolutionary rules very well. So I guess I was just wondering from the panel, what are some of your favorites where they have at least put in some of the homework? My personal, I think you mentioned Tremors on the podcast. Another one I like is actually Lord of the Rings, where they made sure that all the dragons are actually tetrapods and not hexapods, for example.
Yeah, it is very common for fictional depictions of evolution or ecosystems to just kind of use the word evolution. I love the X-Men, but looking at the X-Men, that's not how mutations work. You don't just get wings one day. There are a bunch of fictional things that will pay some attention to it. Pandora in Avatar gets a lot of attention because it's an ecosystem where they put some work into thinking about how these organisms might be related, and these have the same. The first time I saw Avatar, I was sitting in the theater trying to draw the evolutionary connections between, that has 6 arms, that has 4 arms, and I don't like that. And the other one that comes to mind that I always like to point out, there is a movie from 2001 called Evolution. And it is nonsense, but it's fantastic. And I love that they half tried. Because they're kind of, as the aliens are evolving, they're kind of following some steps that you see in the geologic record of Earth, and it's super cool. And then there's dragons, and then it happens in a month, or it happens in 2 days over the course of the movie. So sometimes you get a mix and match.
Pandora definitely is one of my favorites. I also they monstrified them a whole bunch, but the dinosaurs in the King Kong,
the Peter Jackson 2005 one.
Was nice to see the idea of if dinosaurs had stuck around, they weren't just the same dinosaurs that we had. They had evolved a bit. They had changed a bit. These were new forms of previous lineages. And I thought that was a cool concept, that they didn't just slap down Triceratops. They made a different ceratopsian. They made a different horned dinosaur that we hadn't seen before because it had evolved on this island alone. And that was cool.
I think my favorite example is from a book, a book series. Sean and Maguire is what happens if you give the kid who loves to take reptiles home the ability to write 4 books in a year. And she has created this entire urban fantasy world where she has created the entire evolutionary background of every cryptid series in her world so that they all make sense. So you have a species, I can't think of the name right now, but it's a species of snake people where they have very strong dimorphism between sexes. So you get one group that are just big snakes, and then you get another group that are humanoid. They mate within snake form. Their juveniles are snakes, but they have turned into mimics. And she uses a lot of basically mimicry. Cuckoos, dragons. The female dragons actually have evolved the ability to look like beautiful human women who people want to give gold to, so that they have that evolutionary driving goal to hoard gold. So they have slowly, throughout millions of years, turned from reptilian to reptilian human to beautiful blonde news commentators that people want to give money to, and there is an entire evolutionary history that this writer has written to explain why dragons would turn into humans.
What was the writer's name
brilliant.
again?
Shannon McGuire, and the series is Encrypted, and it is the most fun urban fantasy science nerdery you have ever read.
Yeah, I
I
hear the shuffling of
appreciate
phones being taken out to take notes.
Yeah.
In the Godzilla series, there's a presumably natural creature called King Ghidorah, who's a 500-foot tall, 140,000-ton, three-headed space dragon with two tongues in each mouth, who can shoot gravity rays from his mouth, and also turns into a fireball to fly through deep space, and may or may not have human intelligence. What kind of pressures do you think would create such a creature?
Excellent question. And that's
The pressure to make box office money.
Capitalism.
yeah, right.
Hold up, real talk though. Let's not ignore the fact that capitalism,
Right.
fueled by white supremacy, has driven a lot of genetic drift
yeah. Yeah.
and change. So between capitalism and I'm gonna also say speculative evolution, there was some other planetary forces. So it came from a different planet.
Yes.
So they had different gravity and whatever was going on with their solar system. So here, when we talk about so our evolution is driven not just by time. I also didn't mention the silent impact of gravity. Like our gravity has a deeply impactful, like how we're arranged, like how our organs work. So if it was shaped over that also deep time of evolution by a different gravity force, by different molecules in the sky, which y'all know I just throw it into magic because I can't explain it, so it's just molecules. I trust other people to other types of scientists. Then yes, it can do seemingly magical things because different densities. It's the same idea of like why John Carter could do things on Mars that he couldn't do things here, because he had a different density relative to that physical planet, and so it came from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And if I had to say I was creating selective pressures for a spacefaring creature that travels as a fireball, the pressure I would create is on Earth, humans all get energy from caffeine. No. On Earth, you have the animals that make their own heat source, maintain their own body temperature, and you have the ones that gain body temperature from the environment. If I were a spacefaring species, I'm not going to have the shielding of the atmosphere. So I'm not going to be able to regulate using my environment. So maybe the fireball is a way of keeping enough heat within to have enough energy to do anything. So say this creature evolved in a star of some type, not an astronomer, sorry. Big star.
We're gonna fiat that. We're gonna fiat the astronomer.
We're gonna go find noisy astronomer. And make her
so
answer
it's like
this.
some sort of fission fusion thing.
Yeah,
happening,
yeah.
keeping
So
it
this
warm.
creature evolved in that area. Say if they have human intelligence, they've then learned how to harness that, and they're traveling in that spaceship that replicates their human environment.
But is human intelligence really like all of that?
Yeah,
I'm
we'll just
saying.
say
we
we'll
say
say
that as if that's a
sentience.
big thing.
Yeah,
it
well,
could be quite primitive.
Okay, well these sentient cats that evolved in a giant fusion reactor. So they in the same way we would travel in the space shuttle to replicate the environment that we can survive in. They've created their environment from their star. So there's my back of the head. idea.
Hey, so similar to that last question, but going in a different direction. I know y'all are animal people, not plant people. Tell us a little bit about the backstory of Audrey 2. What were the pressures that created that one?
So we did have a whole episode on
We
that.
did.
Yes, there are fans in the audience. So Audrey 2, for those who are unfamiliar, is the plant monster from Little Shop of Horrors, who starts out as a little piranha plant-like thing and then grows into a very big piranha plant-like thing. Audrey 2 is also from space, so we get to make up whatever we want. But here on the planet Earth, there are plenty of carnivorous plants that have structures for capturing animal prey in a variety of ways. There are also fungi that do that. There are fungi that have that grow their mycelium in a little loop that if a nematode goes through it, the loop snaps shut and catches it, and then they can drain the life out of that. So what you would need for Audrey 2, I think at the basic, setting aside the fact that Audrey 2 can talk, and also that depending on what version of Audrey 2, it's also like can hypnotize people. But
which I'm still good with us using our fallback on those episodes of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. But getting a giant plant that eats stuff, probably actually pretty similar to what you'd have here on Earth, as long as there is a bountiful food source. In the case of animals, as long as you have something that can draw them in, like a sweet scent, or the psychedelics to make them think that this plant can promise them riches and sing and can sing to you, absolutely. And probably just a planet with really big things to eat, which drives the evolution of the carnivorous plant that is big enough to fill a good chunk of this room.
Yeah. So, what if Audrey 2 were a organism that combined a plant and a mycelial network?
I was just going to think that, some sort of symbiont.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you've got that mycelial network, not like Star Trek, but like actual fungus. You've got that, like cordyceps, controlling the humans around it to convince it to feed this plant, to make them attracted to this terrifying creature that they should run away from and make them think that they're going to get riches. But in the plant itself could be a fairly intelligent plant that just wants to eat large things.
And some interesting research is coming out that plants are communicating with each other more than we ever realized. Like they're actually communicating. Mushrooms, fungi, as far as I'm concerned, have always been taking over the planet. Like those mycelia can stretch for miles and miles and miles and miles. They innervate everything. There's already evolutionary history of fungi living in symbiosis with the roots of different plants and trees. And we now know evolutionarily, depending on when you learn biology, that mushrooms and plants were more together. Actually, we're more related to fungi than the plants are. That's why it's so hard to kill a fungus, because you have to kill so much of yourself to kill the fungus. And so, they've been slowly taking over, in our heads. And then the zombie fungus that, takes over. So, if you ever watch the movie The Girl with All the Gifts, that movie or that series where the fungi take over and people, return to the stalk source. Essentially, that happens already. They become zombied, and then they give themselves to the main mushroom source. And it's... Yeah, Audrey 2, I'm convinced already does exist. Absolutely, and we've been fooled into doing it already. Yeah.
One more thing I want to mention while we're talking about Audrey 2, and since we're on the topic of plants, we talked about how evolution favors the ability to be successful and to reproduce and to establish a big population. At the end of the story, Little Shop of Horrors, spoilers for Little Shop of Horrors, Audrey 2's plan revealed is to convince people to like Audrey 2 enough to get cuttings of Audrey 2 to then spread the cuttings all around the country, where people will plant them and grow more Audrey 2s. That is something that plants can do. Yeah. That would be much harder for animals. For a intelligent, carnivorous, evil alien plant, what an incredible evolutionary strategy to be able to convince the intelligent people of this planet to spread pieces of you all around the world that will spread into more Audrey 2s. Yeah. And now you've got a planetary population that can evolve forward from there.
Yeah, and that's all because they don't need to sexually reproduce. There's vegetative cuttings. So how you make copies of yourself, sexually, asexually, the time it takes, time matters too. All of that matters. And the fact that many plants can just vegetatively make more copies, start with a whole new fresh one, that is an advantage. It doesn't mean your genes aren't all mixed up necessarily, but if you just need to get copies of yourself out there, they kind of win on that one.
So what you're saying is succulent Instagram is on notice?
I was wondering if you guys are familiar with Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi.
Something preservation society.
Kaiju.
Again, slower.
The question was
Kaiju Preservation Society. Are you familiar with that one?
I am not.
You know what kaiju are?
Mhm.
The giant Godzilla-sized monsters and bigger. They go to another planet, for want of a better word, and at that size, they're too big to provide enough energy through food. And so the larger kaiju have evolved natural reactors, nuclear reactors, to power themselves. What would it take to create that?
That's always been one of my favorite things about Godzilla is that they gave it a different fuel source other than just food. That Godzilla feeds off of radioactive material and energy, which I think this might have come up on one of the last Speculative Evolution panels. There are fungi that can feed off of radiation.
Yeah.
They found them growing all around Chernobyl.
Yep.
Not terrifying at all, but true. And you can get symbiotic relationships with organisms, and so if you could have them fostering colonies of these bacteria, my solution back in the day was in the spines, in Godzilla's spines, but that you could absolutely have them feeding. Now, I don't know how an organism could produce its own radioactive reaction inside its body, because that still takes an input of fuel. They would have to be mining nuclear material to constantly fuel that reaction.
That must have been what they were doing in Godzilla vs. Kong, deep down in the center of the Earth.
Yes, exactly. But if they just were able to find a source of radiation and sleep next to it, that might be able to give them a big boost of energy if they had the right fungus growing throughout their tissues.
So, in movies like Star Wars and Star Trek, you've got thousands of alien races, and they're all very human-shaped. You know, sometimes they're human with pointy ears, sometimes they're humans wearing furry costumes, but they're all generally humanoid. And I was just wondering, like, what are the odds that if we do encounter an alien race, it will be humanoid? And is there a particular shape that you think would be kind of very good or, you know, evolutionary viable for attaining sentience?
Ooh.
Let me
Someone
make
on
sure
the
I
audience
understood
just
that
said
you said
crabs, which is very
a
funny.
shape for sentience? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. That's what I was going to say.
So
We can come back to.
it is definitely true that when we see science fiction, the sentient alien races tend to be shaped like humans. Now, whether that's the best shape, then of course the reason we do that is so that they can be acted by people and so that we can relate to them. But I figure there's probably tons of different shapes that things can achieve sentience on a human level. Someone out there just said cephalopods, which
Yeah, that was going to be the next one too.
Yep, that's squids and octopus and cuttlefish or encephalopods.
Yeah. Did you say decapods?
Yeah.
Potentially. Yeah. So, but this is just interesting. Like, is there like one? Probably not. So the shape also matters. What's happening at that planet of origin? So, in other words, like, what's happening with the gravity? What's happening with that primary substrate? So, I think we're probably going to find something more torpedo shaped, because if you think about water as a medium, like things just kind of just blobbing through. So it could be very, very globular or blobular.
Well, that's something I always think of when it comes to evolution of sentience, because that is a very common sci-fi thing that, well, once you reach sentience, you stand up on two legs with two arms and a face.
You wear clothes.
Yeah, because we are very, very humble as a species. But one thing that people have talked about is, like, why haven't dolphins developed tool use to a level that, you know, chimps have? And the big thing that they're missing is manipulators, something that can actually use tools. And I would actually turn that over to you more about how important tool use would be for the evolution of higher thinking.
So, say we had a world entirely different from our world. We have a world that is, let's say, what is the gas? There's a liquid.
Like Venus-like.
Let's say it's a world without a solid core. It's all mostly like gaseous, low gravity. So let's say octopus that flow through a world that's kind of like water, kind of like air, because the gravity isn't strong. They don't really need to stand up on two legs. They don't need to free two arms. So humans, bipedalism is partially so that in humans, you can hold things, you can carry your young, you can free up those hands. They don't have to be stable because they're not being used to walk anymore.
Yes.
So you get to get more fine motor control, and you can develop those tools. Now, octopus don't need to walk on any one leg, because these octopus are space octopus. They are flowing through a low-gravity liquid-y substance. They've now freed up a bunch of different limbs to grasp things with, and they would probably evolve dedicated, specific grasping limbs, probably with some really strong sensors so that they can feel what's going on in this fluid world. So they could very easily develop tool use, develop cultural ritual activities, because they have this extra, they've freed up their arms. They're not using it for support. They're using it to manipulate the world around them. And octopuses do that. Octopuses are very hard to keep in aquariums at museums and zoos. They escape all the time. They escape in ways that would put your average human teenager to shame. Like, what is this jumping out a window and shimmying down a tree? No, I am going to send a targeted shot of water at that security camera that's glowing a light, and now the humans can't see that light went away because it's annoying me. The humans can't see me, and now I'm like, oh, I'm gonna slip through this little sliver, and I'm gonna go eat fish out of a different aquarium.
I'm gonna unscrew tops.
Yeah. This is an actual octopus learned how to, like, they would shoot out water at a light that was annoying them in their crate, and the aquarium staff could not figure out why this light kept short-circuiting from water. It was because the octopus was like, I'm trying to sleep here. Turn the light off.
Yeah, turn it off. I can't sleep.
You also asked how likely would it be to find a human-shaped alien. The odds are extremely low that they will look like us. And if we do find that it's like the Star Wars or Star Trek universe, that'll be the most ridiculous case of convergent evolution ever conceived of. That every planet just evolved the same biology, separate from one another. That we would have to figure out what is so amazing about that biology.
And Star Trek had an answer for that. They in the Star Trek universe, all of the humanoid species were seeded. Now, it doesn't quite make sense with evolution, because how do you seed DNA that is going to inevitably evolve into a bipedal humanoid species? You don't. You can't. That's because they're going to all of these different worlds. Inevitably, a whole lot of these species would have become crabs, or cephalopods, or birds, or raptors. They wouldn't, or snakes. Like, they wouldn't all be bipedal. But that was Star Trek's answer to that question: was that aliens did it.
Yes.
Hello. So I don't know if you're familiar with Splatoon or the Splatoon series.
A little bit closer, please.
Hi. Sorry. I don't know if you're familiar with Splatoon or the Splatoon series.
What was that series?
Splatoon.
Oh.
The video game.
Okay.
The video game, yes. But I kind of want to ask about cephalings, the main species of the game. So Inklings and Octolings, they're evolved normal squid and octopi who have evolved into humanoid upright forms, but can also morph themselves into an octopus or squid form. They are not water-based, they are oil-based, ink-based. It's very interesting, but the lore dictates that this was Earth after all the humans have gone extinct. and the cephalopods have taken over, and have become intelligent and formed societies akin to human ones.
So what's the question?
I was going to ask, how would that possibly come about? Is there any possible way that cephalopods could evolve to
to take over and stand up?
I'm really surprised that there hasn't been a coalition of octopi and turtle to really take over. Like, I'm really worried if they ever get together, because the octopi, I'm convinced, are really intelligent, then the turtles live literally forever.
Well, I mean, with mimic octopus, they might have already, and we wouldn't know.
We wouldn't know. Like,
How many of the people in this room are
Yeah,
mimic
but,
octopuses?
Raise all your arms if you're a mimic octopus
like, it
right
could
now.
happen. Now, it wouldn't. I think what it is this is where the imagination part comes in. I don't think it'll look the way we think it's going to look. I mean, let's remember, the world is mostly water. Like, the center of the new Earth would actually be like what's happening in the water, and then they'd be like, let's throw all our trash up on land that we don't want in the water anymore, and then they pollute that.
There's a very good point that humans were not predestined to look like humans. Had we evolved in more of, say, a pine forest kind of situation rather than a more plains situation, you're going to get more brachiating. You're going to get less obligate bipedalism, so that you have to be bipedal. You would see more of a transitional, I need to use these limbs to hold on to something and these to tool use. So you're going to see less stable all four limbs. You'll probably see more grasping with all four limbs. There's no reason that, say, a species that evolves like a sloth and is hanging out in trees a lot wouldn't use their back limbs as manipulators and their front limbs to hold on. Why stand up? You could stand down.
Yeah.
You can absolutely get dominant cephalopods, but yeah, they probably wouldn't stand up like people.
Yeah.
All right, one last question.
So, speaking of spacefaring organisms that can survive on the surface of the sun, what about Astrophage from Project Hail Mary? How could that possibly happen from a planet and then they somehow traverse space to go take energy from their local sun?
Someone's going to have to explain what astrophage is to me.
Yeah. I assume it's a star-eating organism just from the name, but I don't know what Hail Mary. I don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, astrophage are bacteria that can traverse. They eat. What do they eat? They use the sun to provide energy.
Can we just wait for you to get the microphone
Yeah.
so everyone hears? Sorry.
Real quick explanation.
Yeah, quick explanation. So astrophage are basically bacteria, essentially, that can go back and forth between a star and the sun. They reproduce at the star. I'm sorry, they reproduce at the sun, at the planet. Sorry, they reproduce at the planet. They travel back to a star in order to gain energy to go back and reproduce again. So the life cycle is essentially, they go to the sun when they're young, they gain all this energy, they go back to the planet, they then reproduce, and then back and forth and back and forth.
So they're like salmon. They're migrating between where they reproduce and then where they grow up.
Yeah. No, I could actually picture that pretty easily. I don't know how they would survive the heat of the sun, but if you have an adult form that can launch the young out of our atmosphere, and there's that one fecal fungus, I can't remember its name, that launches its spores with a pressure capsule and is the fastest living organism on the planet because it would break sound barrier if it were big enough to. And so if you could have them create some stalks and pods that can launch their young into space toward the closest, strongest point of light.
And then slingshot around the sun
Right.
and come back. Well, bacteria also form cysts.
Yes, that's what I was going to say, yep.
So if it's just getting energy up there, I wonder if there's a way that you could have a bacteria that creates a cyst for itself, which is a very capsule dense, really good at surviving harsh conditions, and just be in your little cyst capsule and go around the sun and absorb energy and then come back and then pop out of the cyst for reproduction time.
Yeah, it can be activated when they hit the atmosphere.
Oh, yeah, we've solved it.
I wonder if they could use something like solar flares as a projection. So even so, seafish, which I learned for seahorses, which I learned for another panel this weekend. They actually, the male seahorses that give birth to carry the young, they actually can control when they give birth. They can yeet the baby seahorses out. So they've adapted smooth tissue to basically be able to push out seahorses, since they don't actually have a uterus, a lining like that. They've actually co-opted muscles from other things to be able to basically launch baby seahorses. So say the bacterium do that. They use a solar flare to pull some energy, get some momentum going, and then they get their little cyst capsules, which could then, when you get to the planet, maybe the capsulation dissolves and reproduce. Oh no, they reproduce on the planet.
Yeah.
Okay.
But it could also be a simpler thing where maybe it's our misunderstanding that they're not making it to the sun. They just get up into the upper atmosphere, float there for a bit where the solar radiation is going to be more intense outside of our barrier and protection, and then come back down when they, deflate their Zeppelin cyst.
Once they're full.
Yeah. And then they can rain back down and reproduce on the surface. Like, it wouldn't actually be that unreasonable to have solar-eating bacteria.
I love that the space traveling star visiting bacteria is the most reasonable thing that we've evolved.
Absolutely.
and the reason is because it's bacteria. That's why we keep coming back to fungus and bacteria, because they can do whatever.
Yeah, you asked us for an alien thing to do an alien thing. That's easy.
We have those.
Well, thank you all. But before we go, I would love for you to. Sorry, I would love for all my panelists to let folks know where to find y'all on social media, starting at the end.
Oh, sure. You can find me and Will at the Common Descent Podcast. We are on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all those places. If you'd like to remember the name of our podcast, come up and get a button. We got
They're
buttons
really
up here.
cool.
Common Descent Podcast. Come and find us.
I'm Emily Fink. You can find me as Seelix, Seelix, on the internet, and you'll be able to find me at 4 o'clock in Crystal Ballroom, where we'll be discussing more of the anatomical structures that develop rather than the evolutionary process that created them in alien comparative anatomy.
I too will be in Alien Comparative Anatomy. You can find me there. But on social media, I'm DNLee5 on all platforms. So you can find me there talking about more Dragon Con this weekend.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And at 10 o'clock, my personal favorite panel, the best panel, is Science versus Movies, where the scientists have to explain, no, the science is good, actually. It's great. Please attend. Thank you all. Please rate us on the Dragon Con app. You've been lovely.
Hey, folks, like they said, please rate us on the app. Also, if you do have small change for the charity, please donate if possible. If not, that's fine.
Yes.